Thanks. This webinar is presented by Behavioral Economics in Action at Rutman, along with the Behaviorally Informed Organizations Partnership. And although we're meeting virtually, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. My name is Colin West. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Rutman and the moderator for today's webinar. We're delighted to have Lena Belogolova and Joyce from the Applied Behavioral Science Association. Before I introduce Lena and Connor, I'd like to go over the plan for the webinar today. Following this introduction, our speakers will give a 30 to 35 minute presentation. During the presentation, you can submit questions by using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. At the end of the talk, we'll have a question and answer session in which I'll select questions from the Q&A tab to ask to our speaker. So now I'd like to introduce Lena Belogolova and Joyce. Lena is the co-founder of the Applied Behavioral Science Association, as well as the head of behavioral science at IntelliChanges, behavioral science consulting firm. Lena focuses on translating behavioral science concepts and designing interventions based on behavioral science across many sectors. And Connor is another co-founder of the Applied Behavioral Science Association, and he focuses on incorporating behavioral science in the tech sector. So thanks, Lena and Connor, for being here today, and over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Such a pleasure to be speaking here. Really excited to join this group. We're going to do a short presentation, and we definitely want to make sure that we have time for questions because this is a really interesting topic in terms of where we move the field forward. And so please feel free to submit as many questions as you'd like. I'm excited to work with everybody, and I'm excited to have this conversation. Connor, do you want to say anything? And then we'll get started while I set up.
Oh. Hey, everybody. Good morning. I am having some technical issues, so I apologize. I'll be in and out of video here, but excited to be chatting with all of you today. Appreciate our hosts for hosting us and the great introduction. So excited to share some thoughts about the field and what we're working towards with the Applied Behavioral Science Association.
Give me 1 second. I'm about to share, and we'll go from there. So really kind of in terms of introduction, before I even get into the presentation, Colin mentioned that I have a kind of a consulting company, as well as we started Applied Behavioral Science Association together with Connor. My background is partially in industry and partially in academia. Connor's background is mostly in industry, and then he did get his master's of behavioral science and decision-making from UPenn, which is a newer program that kind of focuses on specifically applying behavioral science. So we are coming from a slightly two different perspectives, which is actually really important as we go into this. There's perspectives from academia, there's perspectives from nonprofits, there's perspectives from for-profits, there's perspectives from policy in terms of how we should be applying behavioral science today. And that's part of what makes this really exciting. And so just want to make sure that you're aware that we're coming at it from a very inclusive and general perspective, and want to make sure that we touch on the things that matter to all of those different components of industry, rather than just kind of one perspective. So let's just jump in. The slight kind of high level agenda of what this is going to be is we'll talk a little bit about what is applied behavioral science as we know it today. Is it distinct from traditional academia? How is it distinct from traditional academia? What is it? What do we mean when we say multidisciplinary? And it's quite young. So what are some areas of opportunity potentially? Who is applying behavioral science today? So there is a robust data set from Steve Wendell, who's at Morningstar doing behavioral science, as well as the Action Design Network, as well as BSPA, as well as some analysis on top of that has been done by the Applied Behavioral Science Association. And then we'll talk very high level about some examples of high profile applications that have gone well and some that haven't. And finally, we'll really spend the bulk of the time, and this is where I think the most interesting questions probably will come up, because this is the areas where we know the least and where we need to really all put our heads together and figure out how we're going to do all this, is standards and ethics, some misconceptions about behavioral science, applied behavioral science that need to be kind of clarified. What does certification look like for this? Applied behavioral science, is it different than getting a degree in decision theory? What is the difference between a PhD versus not? Connor has thought a lot about this, and we'll talk about that. And then community and communication, which is really why we came up with the idea for the Applied Behavioral Science Association. So that's kind of our roadmap, and let's jump right in. So what is applied behavioral science? Applying behavioral science, and this is after looking at definitions across universities and across industry representatives, is really focused on changing behavior. And that's really distinct from understanding behavior, and I want to make sure that we focus on that specifically. So what is behavioral science by the experts or people who are in industry applying it? Well, Matt Wallert, who's the head of behavioral science at Frog, which is a large-scale design firm, is behavior as an outcome, science as a process. That's how he defines it. Pretty pithy, pretty good explanation there. Dr. Joseph Belcher from University of Arizona says the application of multidisciplinary behavioral research and knowledge to solve real world problems. So again, we're moving into this solving real problems, behavior as the outcome rather than science. It's more like the tool is science and the process rather than the actual outcome that we're looking at. And finally, Optimizely, to those that don't know, they are an A/B testing tool for technology companies. And they actually have a whole section on behavioral science on their website already and in their app. And so how they define it is it allows you to deploy solutions that are backed by scientific evidence and helps you know exactly why your last idea succeeded in influencing decision-making, as well as quantify the effect of human behavior. So I kind of want to unpack that a little bit. So again, it's backed by scientific evidence. So we're using as the base scientific evidence, but really the idea is to prove that your idea worked. It influenced some sort of decision that the customer or the person you're trying to influence did. And then finally, quantify and actually measure the effect on the behavior of that individual. So let's dig a little bit deeper. So what is applied behavioral science from Matt? There's the understanding behavior component, which really comes from academia. And then there's the changing behavior component, which is in real life, let's change your behavior over the longer term. And that's really where applied behavioral science is coming in. And I think one of the most important things is to not say that only academia does understanding behavior and only industry does changing behavior. That relationship needs to keep developing, and it's just the prioritization of what is being focused on. So if you're an applied behavioral scientist in industry, your goal and your priority is changing behavior, but understanding behavior is still super important to you. It's just secondary. And if you're in academia, the idea is understanding that behavior is the most important thing. And that's part of your prioritization process. The actual implementation and interventions of changing behavior over the long term, it becomes secondary, not that it's not as important. So really want to make sure that that distinction is clear, at least in the definitions that are being brought out today. And finally, this next one, which is what is multidisciplinary about this? Behavioral economics came out here. It was kind of the intersection of psychology and economics. Then there's psychology, then there's sociology, then there's decision science. And so behavioral science kind of jumped in there and is moving things around a little bit. So it was a lot easier when we just had behavioral economics, but we now have behavioral science, which has a lot more components to it. It's a lot wider scope than just behavioral economics, because it's not just about that. We need to understand context. We need to understand the social narrative that's happening in society around that. And so that's why we're talking about multidisciplinary even more so than it used to be before. On top of that, in the way that it is currently being applied, behavioral science is utilizing data science, for example, and it is utilizing techniques in design to actually implement that. And so again, it's multidisciplinary, even not just from the academic background, but from the industry background as well. Who is using applied behavioral science today and how? So there was a large scale study that was run by Steve Wendell, BSPA, as well as the Action Design Network. BSPA is Behavioral Science Policy Association. And they had over 6,000 or over 7,000 participants answer this survey. So a pretty robust data set. So what they found, and they ran this in 2018, and I don't know if presentations are going to be shared, but there are links so you can look at the data later, is that a big chunk of those folks were consultants. And then there are kind of smatterings, and I kind of already mentioned this, of data science teams, product and design teams, marketing teams, HR teams, and policy teams that started to pop up that had applied behavioral science, either groups and teams, or they were embedded within marketing teams or within product and design teams. What's interesting to note is this is changing. So throughout the pandemic, what we've seen as an organization, the Applied Behavioral Science Association, is that more and more organizations are actually starting to figure out how to embed behavioral scientists either within some of these teams directly and actually have org structures that support that, or they're even hiring people called chief behavioral officers. So that's becoming a lot more prevalent than it was even in 2018. So even in the 3-year kind of change, part of that may be because of COVID. And so we'll see what happens in terms of that behavior shift. But consultants are becoming even more popular, but embeddedness is becoming more so the kind of true form as well. Where is it being applied? This is one of my favorite slides, is that it's happening all over the world. It's happening a lot more in the United States and in the United Kingdom, percentage-wise, but literally there are teams that are popping up everywhere. So Canada has good representation there. I think it's an important slide to show that we all have different perspectives to bring and share with each other in terms of how we should be applying behavioral science. And that communication piece is important, and it's slightly missing. So last year in the Behavioral Science Policy Association, or 2 years ago, conference, there were a number of groups that were presenting interventions they were doing at the beginning of COVID. So I guess last year. And one of the things that really kind of stood out to me was that there was a team in Italy, and then there was a team in, I believe it was Denver, in the United States, that were running similar experiments, and they had no idea. And they were even presenting on the same kind of group and panel, and they had no idea. And so one of the things that we would love to see happen is make sure that that communication becomes stronger, because we should be utilizing each other and not reinventing the wheel, but also using our kind of respective learnings to alter the designs of our experiments and our interventions to make them more successful. Connor, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, there we go. Unfortunately, my computer's still not allowing the Zoom to kick off, so I hope you all don't mind the profile shot of the phone. So with this survey, just a quick point of clarification, Lena, I think you had said 7,000 organizations. It was ultimately 600 to 700 organizations that filled out the directory, and then of that, we had about 300, we'll say 325 usable answers. I've been digging through here to try to get the exact answer, but with the graphs that we're going to show here, it's about 325, maybe 350 that filled out this extensive survey that we were able to generate a couple of the graphs here. And then we have a lot more data on our website, behavioralscience.org. So if this is fascinating to you, then you can dive in further. Lena, I see. Do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. The first two slides, so these two are based on an N of 6,000 to 7,000. We ran then, as the Applied Behavioral Science Association, a further survey, and that's what Connor is referring to.
Got it. Okay, cool. Then, then perfect. So with these two graphs, I mean, you can see they're pretty self-explanatory when we look across the importance of activities that these organizations identified. They across the board, the biggest thing that they are focused on is direct change. It's helping organizations, regardless of the industry, regardless of the setting, these organizations are helping promote the direct behavioral change, which makes sense. It combines with a lot of the definitions that you'll see of applied behavioral science. I mean, it says it in its name. It is all about behavior. So change is the most important piece. Followed closely is the sharing of internal knowledge. I ultimately do a lot of that. It's things such as lit reviews, just getting there. We're in this content economy. I mean, there's endless amount of information out there. And so I find that applied behavioral science roles ultimately become a conduit of taking information, summarizing it, and bringing it to the right people. If you're working with product managers, if you're working with marketers, if you're working with really any sort of stakeholder, a lot of a behavioral science role in these applied settings ultimately is the person who goes out, either generates some of the research or finds some of the research, summarizes it and delivers it, sharing it internally. You can see then it starts to break down more of the industry. So develop products is what is next when we're looking at the very important, but you can see it is a strong, very important, but it also is a not important, has a huge section there. So I think it really depends on the industry on that one. Publishing externally, it seems important for some, doesn't seem important for others. I think, again, this is very industry dependent. There's a lot of industries that if you're a researcher, you can't publish externally. If you're doing research in a corporate setting, a lot of times there that you're not able to publish externally because you're creating content that's supposed to give that company a competitive edge. Changing employees, this is going to be more in the HR setting or all of those companies that are creating products that are intended to help employees change. So again, industry specific, but you can see across the board that even if it isn't their most important thing, there's a fair amount that say that it's fairly important. Marketing, I'm assuming that the people who said that this was the biggest were those that worked in marketing or worked in roles that supported products, et cetera, that could then support. I mean, even in some of the work that I ultimately do, I'm creating research to validate things that are being built, that then the marketing team can utilize that research to encourage people to acquire that product or feature because it will work. And then the last piece, policymaking, is the most varied here. And I think that part of it is because policymaking, a group of individuals will instantly latch onto that and think, oh, that's government. And I like to clarify that policymaking generally, that doesn't mean just governmental policy. People in HR create policy. People that are in operations create policy. So there's a lot of applications of policymaking, but I'm assuming that given this response, what we're ultimately seeing is that a lot of people are believing that this is purely governmental, just given that large block that said that it's not important.
Two quick notes here. One, specifically the share internally piece, I'm really glad you spent a lot of time on that, Connor, because so I've worked with, I would say, over a dozen companies at this point. And the biggest things in terms of themes that I see is really the 3 E's: empower, educate, and evangelize. And I think that especially when you're starting out a field, that is something that needs to be really codified and structured in a way that is clear within an organization. How do you empower other people to use it after you've educated them about it? How do you evangelize that it's successful and how it's good and tell a good story around it? So that share internally piece is really, really important for really pretty much everything else on that list. And so that's why it kind of, especially as an early kind of a field, I would say, is something that's super important. The other piece that I would comment on, and this is just a hypothesis of mine, is policymaking, even if it is within organizations such as legal teams and things like that, it may just be too early from an applied behavioral science perspective to think about how it influences internal rules and policies. So within institutions like academic institutions, we have, for example, the internal review board, and that's part of the structure and that's part of the process. And so that's a policy that's required for every single group. Whereas we just in California, for example, introduced a law against certain dark patterns of behavioral science. And so it may be that we're just not even ready to have that conversation yet. Again, hypothesis, I don't know. Next slide.
Yeah, so when we look at more of what are people applying, and I wanted to pull up the definitions here. I was almost there of giving a little bit more of the actual, what are all of these sections. So when we talk about, there we go, perfect. So when we talk about social, what we're talking about there is descriptive norms and social proofs. Very common, and you can see a lot of people use those. I think that social proofs, it's something that can be applied in almost any setting. All you have to do is say, of other people, these are the things that they're doing. And so you can see that from that easy nature of it. Now, granted, it's not always used correctly. We just talked about dark patterns. There's also those great examples of, hey, 10% of your colleagues have finished this, you should finish it too, or help us out and finish it. And it ultimately does the reverse. And it's a social proof that says, hey, nobody's doing it, so why should I spend my time doing it? So those 81%, I don't know if all of them are correct applications, but it is the most used technique within these groups. When we talk about friction, we're talking more about the use of defaults and automative features. Again, you can see that or I'm flipping it around, I'm reading it here. So I should say the attention, which is the next most used, is reminders and planning prompts. And so this is, again, another highly used one. Reminders, notifications, anything to do with tech is going to utilize those, but we could even see them with the use of any sort of marketing. Reminders are going to be really helpful. Yeah, that would just be a couple of settings. Healthcare would be another one that I've seen reminders used extensively. And then planning, I think, is weaving more into the literature. I think there's been some great examples recently. I'm thinking of the BCFG study that was done with nudges on vaccinations, that one of the best nudges that worked was something that allowed the individual to kind of set a plan for themselves to go and get vaccinated. When we look at choice set, we're talking about curating, ordering, framing. I would add in personalization. When you have the data, I think that there's an outstanding opportunity within choice setting to create and help select the right choice for an individual. Choice overload's real. Again, I talk about, and I spend a lot of, recently I've been spending a lot of my time thinking about just information overload and how we really are. There's, again, I work in the work setting. I think a lot about how ultimately there's more emails that you can ever read than you're going to. There's more documents in your office or in your organization than you're ever going to be able to access. So trying to bring the most relevant information to an individual is a huge problem. And that, again, applies across pretty much any area that there's as much content as most areas have. Friction.
So can I jump in really quickly on the choice overload? So amongst companies that I've worked with, and obviously company that I'm working with now, choice overload is one of the top things, and specifically choice overload with the antecedents of choice overload. So that paper, I believe by Andre Cherny, about preference, certainty, or uncertainty, and how that affects choice overload, especially decision intent and how that affects choice overload. In the tech setting is one of the most used concepts I would say that I've ever used with clients.
It's a great example. So with friction, I brought up default automation. These again, as tech weaves itself more into all the work that we do, there's more opportunity to set defaults in processes, in technology, just across the board. Same thing with automation, and behavioral science can be used to take something that is a bottleneck, or take a process that people are getting stuck at, and being able to make that more fluid, whether that's through default, whether it's through automation or some other mechanism, just reducing that friction overall. When we see the plummet, it is now with incentives. So incentives, we listed as price, payment, and other rewards. That could be what was causing people to kind of say, no, I don't use incentives as much. But just it was interesting to see that people don't use rewards. They don't at least consider themselves using rewards that often. Only a little over 50% said that. Habits, we talked about building or breaking habits. Again, you can see only 50%. I think a lot of people ultimately are driving towards habitual behavior development. Maybe they just didn't think about it in the context of, my goal is to actually inspire people to create new habits. And then the least responded to, and I did part of this data analysis, I remember seeing a lot of people that said that they use organizational architecture were in HR or the peripheral departments. And so I think that people just became concerned when they saw internal processes, organizational changes. I mean, really, there is probably a large suite of people that don't do that sort of work. It is more of an internal, more of an HR thing. But there, especially with development of internal processes, I'm assuming that number is a little low for the amount of people that actually do it. But regardless, it was most of the HR people and those sort of individuals that ultimately selected that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. One other point that I'll make is friction is another one that I use quite a bit, and specifically friction in the form of slowing down the process through reciprocity. And what I mean by that is, not thinking about when you ask questions, the order in which you ask for information from people. So for example, asking for your first name and last name in email is something that people are used to, but asking for a birthday without any reward and kind of that process of reciprocity and feeling like you're interacting with the system rather than just giving a lot of information and not getting anything back is something that really, really resonates, one, with the tech industry as well as even non-tech industries, because a lot of people have sign-up flows. And so that's something that I've used pretty substantially as well. Let's see. It's not, oops. So really quickly, just a few, I know we're running behind a little bit, but a few examples of applied behavioral science at scale. Ideas 42, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, is probably the biggest nonprofit in the behavioral science space. And so they work both on the policy side as well as the consulting side, working with larger scale organizations. Another trend is that larger companies started doing these kind of labs where they actually have groups of people that are cross-functional. So think like data scientists, in addition to behavioral scientists, in addition to product managers, who build solutions, kind of product solutions in a vacuum and test them out before they roll them out into a larger product. So that's been really, really interesting to see is these develop. So there's two different labs like that. Hinge is a dating website, in case you didn't know. And so they have a head of behavioral science, and Logan Urey, she really thinks about the research and kind of evangelizing behavioral science, but also in helping test ideas of how to make sure that Hinge actually helps you find love instead of be just another dating website. And finally, Google, with Maya Shankar at the helm, they actually have a few different versions of behavioral science. And so they've been applying it in different capacities for quite a bit, I think, at least for the last decade. And even early on, before Irrational Labs with Dan Ariely and Kristen Berman were who they were working as consultants with Google on the HR side as well as the product side. So really, it's been done from a consulting standpoint at Google. It's now embedded, I believe, in their HR department. And then it's also embedded kind of larger scale in product and quantitative research as well. Connor, do you want to add anything here?
I think you did a good job covering it.
Great. And really, this is the last piece, and I'll just spend probably another 5 minutes here, and then we can go to questions, which is the areas of opportunity. So one, the standards vary greatly, right? It's the infancy, I would say, of this field. And so really, in the pre-stage, before we're using applied behavioral science, like, how do you define a hypothesis in behavioral science in terms of behavior change? What are the research strategies they use? Do we want it to be rigorous from an academic standpoint? And how do we make sure that it's still both internally and externally valid if we can't have the same constraints that academia has? What about the ethical check for working with human subjects, right? There's a robust practice of, as I mentioned already, IRB. What does that look like in industry for applied behavioral science? Is it more lightweight? What kind of lightweight? What does that mean? So there's a number of others as well. When you're actually inside running a study or doing a project, what are the data collection tools that are acceptable versus not? Is Qualtrics the standard? Is that the only one? And then is there a monopoly there? What type of statistical methods? If you don't have experts in statistics, is your research still valid? What about A/B testing methods and technology? So I mentioned one of them is Optimizely that helps you with A/B testing. There's a bunch of other ones. They all have slightly different strategies and back ends in terms of how that experimentation is implemented. Is there a standard of how we want to run applied behavioral science experiments? And then incentives and redemption tools for those incentives, right? Some people have codes that they get sent. Some people have gift cards they get sent. Some people get like just Visa gift cards they get sent. Some people get specific gift cards to stores they get sent. So it really, what is actually going to work better? That's almost a behavioral kind of analysis and experiment on its own. And there's a bunch of others that come up within. What are the types of questions you should ask in terms of leading versus not leading questions? That's something that I work on a lot with teams like designers who are attempting to run testing. And then finally, post the analysis, right? How do you at least make people aware that confirmation bias is a thing? How do you present information and you frame it correctly, right? If kind of your goal is to make someone happy in terms of showing a specific conversion rate, how do we make sure that people, stay honest and don't skew numbers in a different way? How do you actually apply it, right? So you may present a great result, but nobody actually takes it up and applies it because it's too much work in an organization. So you may have that and it doesn't work. One of the things that I thought about when the Facebook kind of scandal happened last week is they actually ran a decent study that had a pretty interesting result, but the way that it was being reported was very one-sided, right? They just said that there were issues that girls who were using Instagram were having problems. There were also a lot of girls whose lives were made better. And so how do we present that information? How do we communicate it? And then how do we apply it? The behavior change outcomes, and this brings me back again to dark patterns. I saw a question come in about that, and I'll answer that in the Q&A. But really, what are intended and unintended consequences, right? Ideal situation is in that upper right corner, which is that we target a specific behavior, we want to get a positive outcome, and we get it, and it's intended. Everything else is kind of open-ended. We don't know. And so how do we start having a conversation about that? Misconceptions, just some. There's a lot. So applied behavioral analysis in the mental health space, it isn't that. I'm personally experiencing this because I have an open head in my full-time job, and there are a lot of people who are applying with experience as therapists. So that's one misconception. Another one is social science and behavioral science the same thing? They actually differ quite a bit in scope, subject, and methodology, but they do overlap in some components. That behavioral science is just nudges. We all know, given the people who are probably on this call, that it's not. But how do we communicate that? Because nudges is really nice as a communication tool. Behavioral science research is slow, right? That's not necessarily true. You can run a quantitative study within a day if you have the right setup. But because it's research, it has kind of that connotation that it's going to take months and months to do. That it's on the other kind of spectrum, that it's simple and easy. I can go pick up reading, nudge, or influence, or behavior, or predictably irrational, and then be an expert and know how to apply it. And then kind of the most important ones that I think that I put at the end here is that the experiments are going to produce the desired outcome. I think this is part of a misunderstanding of what science is in industry, is that you'll get null results sometimes. You'll get the opposite of what you want sometimes, and that's okay. And that's interesting in itself. And I think making sure that those expectations are set within all of these organizations in that way is one of the most important things we can do as applied behavioral scientists. And then finally, and this is something that's happening across behavioral science, not just applied, is what effect does environment and context have on every single effect that we've measured and looked at. Connor, you want to take this one? We also looked at certification.
Yeah, so as Lena just introduced there, so one of the things that we are curious about with the explorations of the Applied Behavioral Science Association, and also just something that I've heard a lot and has been something I've been tracking for the last 2 years. Really, it was catalyzed. It started because of me being in my master's, looking at trying to figure out how to get jobs in this applied behavioral science space. Very few jobs out there have the title of applied behavioral scientist. And so I started to ask around, well, why is there no certification? I started my career in HR. I was interested in getting a SHRM certification, Society for Human Resource Management. So there's a question of, well, HR has one, project management has one with Project Management Institute. Why does behavioral science not have one? And so, so that's been something I'm exploring for the last 2 years. ABSA is now exploring that, and we conducted a survey that this had about 120 responses, and you can see that across the board, and yeah, it might be a little hard to read. The left pane there, it starts with not important at all, a little important, somewhat important, and then very important. So very important is on the bottom. So across the board, people see that certification in behavioral science, that there are going to be many variables that are highly important to it, which is that it's developed by a well-regarded organization. That makes sense. They want to, that is across the board, the biggest thing that people want to see is that if there is a certification out there, it has to be developed by a group that people know. It has to have a good, rigorous validation process. This goes to the lens of kind of the opposite of what Lena was saying, of like the people that say, oh, I've read Nudge, I can go and conduct a full experiment now. That certification will help with that threshold, but it has to have some sort of validation process to make sure that it is true that the person has those skills. Well-known professionals are certified. That's social norming to a degree. I see the value of a certification coming from the opportunity there. I should say really quickly too, we cut out a slide here, but there was a slide before this that said across the board, people are interested in a certification. So we did validate that hypothesis. We followed up with these questions of what are the attributes that lead to a successful certification. But just breezing through these again quickly, things that are, one that wasn't as important was certification is endorsed by business leaders or leading companies. That one I thought was rather interesting. It could just be a bias of the group. There was more academics than professionals that rated this, and you can see that in the next The next response was that certification is endorsed by academics or universities, did have higher ratings. And then the last piece is that colleagues have shared positive experiences. True social norming here, or really we'll just say like true word of mouth is marketing is what we're seeing here, that if people hear good things about it from their friends, they're going to be more interested in this certification. So again, people across the board interested in the idea of certification, and we learned more about what would make a certification authentic through this survey here.
Awesome. Thank you, Connor. And we are basically at the end. So basically, and finally, people, and I kind of, this is true throughout all of these things, is people want to talk about these things because it's a pretty young field. People are hungry for a community, like we all just discussed. And so we really asked a question about, without hearing any other details, how interesting does the concept of an applied behavioral science association seem to you? And people found it overwhelmingly interesting. And when we've had participation with the Applied Behavioral Science organization, that's really what it was, is to create this community to talk about all of the things that we just presented about, is really have a space to discuss things and then help the field grow and develop, whether it's standards, whether it's certification, whether it's ways to communicate with each other, whether it's mentoring. And so there's a lot of different initiatives. So really, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I don't want it to seem like a sales pitch, but really we started with Behavioral Science Policy Association building ABSA. And so feel free to go check it out. And if you want to get involved, we are seeking people to get more involved. And that's it. So we have some questions. I know I ran over, so apologies.
Thanks, Lena and Connor. So everybody, just a reminder, please put your questions into the Q&A chat at the bottom right of your screen. Before we jump in, I'll just ask one quick question. So you mentioned tech companies have made some pretty good strides in applying behavioral science, but they have to do so pretty narrowly, changing where a button is on their platform or marketing messages. Behavioral scientists often work within data science or UX, product teams, marketing, or as a standalone unit. From your experience so far, what seems to be the more effective way of doing things? Having a behavioral scientist on each team or a standalone unit? And how can tech companies get beyond these kind of small incremental tweaks to some more meaningful behavioral science applications?
I'm happy to take this one. Connor, feel free to jump in. So I've worked at companies that have done both. So they either have a larger scale or component of the organization where they have a chief behavioral officer. As I mentioned, I was a part-time chief behavioral officer for about a year as a consultant for a startup. And then there's kind of embeddedness within the teams. It really depends, I think, on how large the company is and at what stage of belief in behavioral science they're at. So for example, it's really, really difficult to come into an organization that has 1,000 people and say, okay, you should all use behavioral science, and this is how you should use it from an applied behavioral science perspective, and let me embed those kind of components within everything you do. So for those, my experience has been having kind of this very small, almost like incubation idea team seems to work best. And then you start propagating different ideas from that perspective. And then maybe eventually it'll end up that they say, hey, I want a behavioral scientist on my team. If you're starting early enough, so there are startups that I work with that are like Series A, for example. For those people who aren't familiar, Series A is almost the earliest round of funding for a startup. And those folks are willing to, if it works, embed kind of the perspective of a behavioral scientist in every part of the organization, just because it's easier. So I would say path of least resistance, if we're going to go a little bit behavioral on it, for the size, based on the size of the organization and the desire to apply it.
I'll just chime in too really quick and say, I think that this is something I think about a lot. And for anybody that's interested in the behavioral design, behavioral change within product sort of tech sector, Amy Butcher has a great book called Engaged. And I really like how she tees it up. She says there's kind of two areas of impact that behavioral science is having on tech. One is surface level, exactly what you said there, tweaks to the page, A/B tests using behavioral science language, etc. That is like the surface level. And that is where like 90% of behavioral science is being applied right now, is a lot of that. And then the remainder 10-20% is using behavioral science actually within the product. And that's where I spend a lot of my time, is thinking about developing metrics that can measure if a product is having its intended effect. So instead of looking at is the Apple Watch used, we'll use the example that I always love to use is Apple Watch used? Do I lift it? Do I wear it on my wrist, etc.? Those are how a majority of the tech sector measures their success, is monthly active, daily active usage. But it's another question to ask, what is the intent of the Apple Watch? Well, it's to make sure you live a healthy life. How do you actually measure that? Well, you look at things like, does it cause a person to stand more? Does it cause a person to exercise more, et cetera? And you can develop metrics to see if that is the case. And so that is the 10-20% of the work. The deeper diving is designing features with the intent of change at its core, and then actually setting up measurements to see, is that change that's being driven towards actually occurring? And so I would say that is where the next level is. And that happens, like Lena said, when you get to the point where you're starting to think about embedding teams and having behavioral scientists work closely with product managers, et cetera. That's where it happens.
Got a question from Kelly and a related one from Julie here. Both are kind of concerned about the dark side that you mentioned. Kelly asked, what about backlash to some of these techniques that are becoming more prevalent? For instance, some people might start recognizing that they're getting nudged, and it could be kind of spoil the well for some of these. How do you see putting guardrails on the types of things that companies do? And are you concerned at all at some of these backlashes of companies using nudges that people might perceive as unethical?
I think that's an excellent question. I think that it's going to be some sort of interaction between policy and some sort of policy within organizations. So kind of governmental policy as well as policy within organizations to control that potentially. One of the first questions, I think, by Julie was about the new law. And so it was very, very specific law about like something that subverts or impairs a consumer's choice to opt out. So it was like very, very particular. It wasn't all dark patterns. So it was kind of like, if you use confusing language, like double negatives, like I think I have a good examples here. Don't not sell my personal information, or making it really difficult to find a way to cancel something like that. So that's what that law was about, Julie. But again, we're in infancy, right? And so every new piece of science, I think, is going to have a little bit of backlash because people don't know how to use it correctly. And so I think that that's kind of where we're at with applied behavioral science. I think added to this is, of course, sensationalism. And so if you have, if you've watched, I'm sure a lot of you have watched The Social Dilemma, and we can have this whole separate conversation about that. In that movie, they only presented one side, right? They only presented the bad parts of behavioral science and how they were, used at Facebook. There are a lot of good ways that Facebook has used behavioral science. And so we need to have a more even-handed conversation. And part of that means a good relationship with media as well. And finally, in terms of it not working or working, we keep rerunning a bunch of these studies, not to say that we're not seeing some part of a replication crisis, obviously. And these studies work. For example, loss aversion or social proof works on professors who study social proof and loss aversion. So I actually don't have that strong of a fear that it's going to be working less. Connor, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say, one of the pieces you said in there, I think is the most important in my mind, at least to start, and that's just communication. And that's I think the great example that I always talk about is that Uber. So Uber had that 2017 article that was in the New York Times. If you have a chance, check it out. It's, like I said, I think it's the gold standard of whenever I'm working with a team and I say, what do we not want to have? It's an Uber article because it took behavioral science and it spun it in a way that made it seem like it was really disastrous. And honestly, from what I've read there and conversations I've had, I don't think they were doing anything that was really out of the norm for how not just behavioral science is used, but how design is applied, how user experience is applied, how even product management is applied. They weren't doing that much different. What happened was somebody caught a trail of what they were doing and had enough information to write an article that wound up in the New York Times before they can make any comments. And so I think that is the bigger picture, is the more vocal that one can be, the more that they can explain, we are using nudges because we're trying to improve this. We are encouraging you to do this because in the past, you've said you want to achieve these goals. So the more transparent that something can be, the better. And it's just get out there before somebody does an expose that says, this is what's going on.
Harshita has a question about the future of behavioral science, and I'll kind of add a little bit to that question. There was a recent Bloomberg article on the death of behavioral economics. And a lot of tech companies are investing a ton in machine learning, and some of them even have the opinion like, hey, we actually don't care how understanding behavior, we're just trying to move it. It can be a black box, and we're going to use the powerful tools of machine learning. But just interested in your perspective on the future of behavioral science, and maybe with those two caveats of, hey, do we need to understand behavior? And do you think that Bloomberg article is right on the death of behavioral economics?
I think that's a great question. I think I laugh because I thought that article was entertaining. So I developed a course when I was at Facebook on the basics of heuristics and biases, and it became a requirement for data and product. And one of the things that we talked about was how there are certain things that are obvious to us versus things that are not obvious to us. And one of the things that people keep talking about is AI and how scary it is. And then we started using the terminology that you just said, which is machine learning, because we realized that we need machine learning, which means we need to understand and give a data set or give some information about the behavior and existing behavior to the system to learn from. So we're already starting to move back from kind of this fancy artificial intelligence all-knowing to machine learning, which is using data of our behavior. And so pretty sure that in order to create good machine learning algorithms, even if that's the direction we're moving in, ones that are equitable, ones that are representative, and ones that actually represent the behaviors that exist in society, we are going to need to understand behavior, especially because changes are coming to that behavior. So for example, how many people started ordering more groceries over the pandemic whose behavior is going to change? We don't know how long that's going to change for. Is that going to be a continuous behavior change, or is that like a temporary behavior change? You can build a model that says, okay, well, for this year and a half, it looks like everybody started ordering from Instacart. And then your model is going to be wrong in about a year if half of those people go back. And so how do you, that's what's exciting, frankly, to me about behavioral science, is that it is constantly changing because we keep changing and we keep learning. And frankly, we start learning more about how our brains operate. So I think both of those are exciting to me.
Well, thanks everyone for the questions. We've got our final minute here. And I'd just like to take it to thank Lena and Connor for leading the webinar today. A full recording of this webinar will be available on our website by clicking on the tab labeled Events, and then the BEAR webinar series. So our next webinar is going to be on November 17th. It'll feature Rashad Habib, who's an assistant professor of marketing at Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University. And with that, I'll just say thanks everybody for attending. And you can exit this by just closing your Zoom screen.
Thank you so much, everybody. And feel free to reach out if you have any other questions or thoughts or want to work with ABSA. Thanks.
Bye, everybody.